UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 to isolate Taiwan by misinterpreting the resolution to justify its fraudulent one China principle, although the resolution makes no mention of Taiwan, does not authorize the PRC to represent Taiwan in the UN system.
Now, sitting on the Armed Services Committee and the China Committee, I can tell you I am confident that if Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party do what they have promised to do and try to take over this island, try to start this war, we will win it. We will defeat them.
Our plan is to roll back Chinese aircraft. If we can't roll it back in under 7 to 10 days, in my mind, the ground forces that Charlie's been talking about, the Taiwan ground forces, will get overrun by a Chinese lodgment. I think we really have to get it back pretty rapidly.
Hello， 大家好，我是八九。昨天我分享了在5月15号，美国对中政策小组在美国的国会展开了一个中共习近平在2027年侵台的这个听证会。那我分享了其中的2个小片段。那其实这个听证会总时长2个多小时啊，所以我今天打算放出前半段将近1个多小时的听证会，希望大家有空可以把它看完。这个非常的重要。很多人都说美国会放弃啊，美国会怎么样？但事实上，因为台湾属于第一岛链，台湾属于美国的直接利益。所以美国开了这个听证会，美国的所有这种将官看的都比台湾人自己看台湾还来得重要。当然，这个听证会后面有些将官都说到会奋起抵抗，一定会救援台湾。他们其中里面也提到了，不该是我们比台湾人更注重这一块，因为毕竟台湾人是直接生活在台湾岛上的。那话不多说，我已经把这个翻译影片做出来了，大家敬请观赏。
Jinping's ambitions this decade. 2027 is not an American date, but a Chinese one. Xi has ordered the People's Liberation Army to be ready to take Taiwan by force by 2027. Xi's directive is backed by the largest military buildup World War II on land, at sea, in the skies, in space, and across cyberspace. And that date, 2027, also marks the end of this Congress. That means that the 119th Congress may be the last full legislative session with a chance to alter Xi's calculus. We cannot delay. We must close critical gaps now. Weapon stockpiles, forward posture, contested logistics, cyber defenses, and Taiwan's readiness. Every decision we make on defense spending, arms deliveries, posture planning must be driven by that urgency, because deterrence delayed is deterrence denied. We have a great group today to deliver this critical message and discuss our plan and our path forward to deter the Chinese Communist Party's catastrophic ambition. So today, I'll be asking tough, necessary questions every member of Congress should be thinking about. What does China's military buildup really tell us about its intent? How do we help Taiwan turn its strategy into reality and actually get U.S. systems delivered on time? What are the most urgent gaps in U.S. force posture and capabilities, especially across the First Island chain? What cyber threats could blind or cripple our response before a shot is even fired? And what steps can we take now with our allies and partners to build multilateral deterrence that Xi can't ignore? Let me close with this. We are not seeking war. We are trying to prevent war. And prevention only works if Xi believes that the cost of aggression is too high to bear. That requires action, serious enough, visible enough, and fast enough to shift the risk calculation in Beijing. That's the work ahead. This hearing is part of that, and I thank our witnesses for helping us to get it right. So let's begin. I now recognize Ranking Member Raja Krishnamurthy for his opening statement.
Between Taiwan and the U.S. and the CCP's growing threat to Taiwan and, by extension, America and the world. First, there's a problem we need to address, Mr. Chairman. Americans don't know much about Taiwan. This scene from the latest season of the hit HBO series White Lotus, which takes place in Thailand. But one of the leads, Victoria, confuses it for somewhere else.
We're here to check out this meditation center because I'm gonna live there for at least the next year.
You want to live in Taiwan?
At least she confuses Thailand for Taiwan, not China. But Victoria is not alone in her geographic illiteracy. 3 years ago, I had the privilege of visiting Taiwan for my first time with then Speaker Pelosi. After the trip, this poll by Morning Consult was taken asking Americans if they could find Taiwan on a map. It turns out that only 34% of Americans can correctly identify Taiwan, which is that green dot on the map. A lot of people thought Taiwan was in other places, where these yellow dots indicate even up in the Arctic Circle in Russia. This hearing is important for many reasons, not necessarily to teach geography, but as an opportunity to clearly explain to Americans why Taiwan is so important. First, I want to talk about values. When I've been to Taiwan, I've been bowled over by how amazingly vibrant Taiwan's democracy is. Let me show you this scene here. This is the celebration in Taiwan after President William Lai was inaugurated last May. Now, Mr. Chair, you and I were in Taiwan right before this particular celebration, and I'm upset that we missed the party with street dancers, tiger costumes, and that big blue horse. In contrast, this was the CCP's recent celebration of Xi Jinping getting an unelected third term, setting up to be dictator for life. So here you have the contrast. On one side of the strait, you have a one-party dictatorship, and on the other side is Taiwan, a democracy doing everything it can to make sure that, in the words of one great Illinoisan, government of the people, by the people, and for the people does not perish from the earth. This brings me to my second point, which is about the economy. A lot of Americans may not appreciate just how essential Taiwan is for our own prosperity in America. Taiwan is America's 7th largest trading partner, and it is a huge market for U.S. exports. Take my home state of Illinois, for example. Taiwan, believe it or not, is the 2nd largest importer of Illinois corn and the 3rd largest importer of Illinois soybeans. Soybeans, Dusty. Taiwan is also a major investor. Since 2022, Taiwan's investment in America has skyrocketed, surging from $1 billion in 2022 to $14 billion just 2 years later in 2024. This includes the first installment of $165 billion in investment that one Taiwan semiconductor company alone is going to make, namely TSMC. This brings me to my final point. Before Taiwan's election last year, the CCP said that the results would mean, quote, peace or war. I showed you how Taiwan celebrated its successful democratic election. But the PLA responded just a little differently, practicing a blockade and a missile attack on Taiwan. This is a clip courtesy of Chinese state television. A little ominous, if you ask me, but that's how they greeted the results of the election. We know that Xi Jinping has ordered the PLA to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027, and that clip gave you a visual of what a prelude to a possible invasion could look like. According to a recent study, a conflict over Taiwan would be absolutely devastating for the world. It would drop global GDP by a staggering $10 trillion, or 10% in one single year. And as you can see, a war over Taiwan would be much, much worse than even the COVID pandemic at its height. Losing access to Taiwan's semiconductors alone would push the U.S. into a, quote, immediate Great Depression. People would die, and our economy would crash. America, as the chairman mentioned before, America does not want a war over Taiwan. A CCP attack on Taiwan would be unacceptable for our prosperity, our security, and our values. Chairman Xi, know that America on a bipartisan basis stands for peace across the Taiwan Strait. However, we will not tolerate actions that put peace at risk. Thank you, and I yield back.
If any other member wishes to submit a statement for the record, without objection, those statements will be added to the record. Now I'd like to introduce our witnesses today. I want to start with General Charles Flynn, is the former Commanding General of the United States Army Pacific, a 4-star command that made him the Army's senior official in the Pacific. We're grateful for his decades of service and for joining us today. Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery is the Senior Director of FDD's Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation. Previously, for more than 30 years in the United States Navy, including as Director of Operations at U.S. Pacific Command and as Commander, Carrier Strike Group 5. Finally, we are joined by the Honorable Kirk Campbell, who most recently was the 22nd United States Deputy Secretary of State. Currently serves as Chairman, co-founder of the Asia Group. I want to welcome all of you and appreciate you being with us. With that, I want to recognize General Flynn.
The threat of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is no longer distant or theoretical. The urgency to restore credible deterrence in the Indo-Pacific has never been greater. Taiwan's security is not only about protecting a vibrant democracy, it is about preserving regional stability, defending U.S. interests, and maintaining the credibility of our alliance network. From Japan to the Philippines, from Australia to India, about defending our homeland and gaining forward positional advantage. People's Liberation Army, the PLA, is China's primary instrument for forcibly invading and unifying Taiwan. Among its branches, the PLA Army is the decisive force. We must stop pretending that this is just a naval or air power problem. If the PLA Army cannot land, cannot maneuver, cannot hold ground, and cannot subjugate the people of Taiwan, it cannot win. If we can prevent them from even attempting to cross, we deter the war altogether. Far too long, we've invested in exquisite systems to fight a sea and air campaign, but left ourselves exposed where it matters most, on land, where wars are won or lost. Land power, not in isolation, but as the backbone that enables the interdependencies of the joint force, is what enables deterrence, creates persistence, builds partnerships, is resilient, and develops the deep infrastructure that sustains the fight, providing the operational endurance we need. No other service delivers long-range fires, integrated air and missile defense, theater sustainment, command and control, and mobility across scale like the U.S. Army. These are not future capabilities. They are being fielded now through multi-domain task forces, logistics hubs, and joint fires networks in Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and beyond. But we need to go further and faster. We must establish a distributed, resilient land power posture across the first and second island chains, backed by rapid access agreements, robust joint exercises, and pre-positioned equipment that accelerates our response times. This is not just a U.S. Army issue. Our most capable partners in Asia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, India, and Indonesia, all field large and capable armies. If we integrate them, if we train and network them to operate with U.S. forces, we create an Indo-Pacific land power network that multiplies deterrence tenfold. PLA does not fear our ships and aircraft. In fact, they expect them. It has built an A2AD arsenal to deny them. What it fears is a credible force that can counter its army, on its flanks, in its interior, before it assembles and loads, and before it ever reaches Taiwan. That's what forward-positioned, allied land power brings to the table. This approach is more sustainable and more affordable than betting on billion-dollar platforms that are vulnerable to missile saturation, electronic warfare, fragile supply chains, and other emerging threats. Instead of chasing perfection, what we need is persistent presence. Hard to kill, hard to ignore capabilities anchored in both geography and partnerships. This includes asymmetric defense investments by Taiwan. I support President Lai's emphasis on mobile survivable systems, but these must be paired with deep civil-military integration, reserve reforms, territorial defense strategies, and above all, training, and more training. A resilient society helps deny the PLA the quick, clean victory it seeks and shifts the cost calculus back onto Beijing. Now, how do we operationalize this? Let me highlight three key Army capabilities that matter most in the Indo-Pacific. First, mobile ground-based strike systems like Typhoon and HIMARS can disrupt PLA planning and decision-making. We need more of these, longer ranges, reloadable, mobile, and fully networked into a joint fires web. Second, the Army's multi-domain task forces. They bring together long-range sensing, cyber, space, AI, electronic warfare, and fires into a seamless operational construct. These units provide targeting, deception, and control across all domains and must remain a top investment priority. Third, none of this works without sustainment. The Army leads in logistics, medical support, engineering, depot-level supply maintenance, and inland transport. It's the backbone of the entire joint concept. Without Army sustainment, agile combat employment from the Air Force and expeditionary basing cannot function. We must push forward AI-enabled manufacturing, co-production, maintenance, and pre-positioned stocks now, not later. Army forces also build lasting regional partnerships that no other service can. These relationships secure terrain, both physical and human terrain, and they build the security architecture that binds the region together. That's real deterrence. So I'm going to urge this committee to consider a strategic realignment, expand joint campaigning with Army-led partners, invest in long-range precision fires, integrated air and missile defense, AI, EW, resilient networks and theater logistics, build and strengthen the land power coalition that already wants to work with us, and recognize the PLA Army as the decisive threat vector for Taiwan. You can't invade Taiwan unless you can generate an invasion force. And that is what we must prevent. So let me close with this. Deterrence is not a speech and it's not a flyover. It's not a sanction or a carrier patrol. Deterrence is the sum of this equation: posture plus capability plus messaging plus will. It requires persistent presence, it demands deep partnerships, and it is the certainty in the mind of the adversary that aggression will fail. We still have time to prevent war, and we must, but time is not on our side. A focused land power strategy integrated with our allies and synchronized across the joint force is how we deny the PLA its objective, preserve peace in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you, Chairman and members. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. Dr. Campbell, the floor is yours.
It's also the case, first of all, I'm grateful to be joined with such wonderful patriots who've devoted so much of their careers not only to the maintenance of peace and stability in the Western Pacific, but also to American power in the Indo-Pacific. I will say that this peace and stability which we enjoy across the Taiwan Strait is largely a result of legislative action. This is the example of legislative leadership, beginning with the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, continuing with the work subsequently, enhancing Taiwan's defense capabilities, ensuring that both parties remain vigilant to the threats and the challenges, and that we stand firm behind Taiwan. So that needs to continue. I think it's critical and vital. Second point, just very quickly, the ranking member described Taiwan. The truth is this is an enormous achievement by the Taiwanese people, but we should take some credit for that. What Taiwan has achieved technologically, democratically, the resilience of their society. To be honest, I can remember visiting several years ago during a very difficult election period thinking, oh my gosh, look at the challenges that they're facing. Their democracy in many respects is more resilient than our own. This is a remarkable achievement. They are a partner with us in so many different ways, and this should be commended and embraced. Third thing, just to underscore, for decades, it was only the United States that was recognizing and supporting Taiwan's importance. But over the course of the last several years, something remarkable has happened. Many of our allies and partners are joining with us in engaging Taiwan, and they are speaking out publicly that they too have an interest in the maintenance and peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Now, the gentleman sitting next to me can tell you all the important elements of deterrence on the military side, but I will also tell you Beijing takes notice in how other countries respond, and the fact that we've gone from one or two countries talking about the importance to Taiwan to absolutely dozens now is an enormous achievement, not only of this body, but the United States, and that should continue. Fourth, just quickly on capabilities. You've heard a lot about what needs to be done with respect to the indigenous military and defensive capabilities of Taiwan. I stand with the gentleman here on those issues. I would differ slightly with the general. I believe that this is a naval theater, but that's probably sort of an intramural thing that we can get to. I'll talk to you mostly what I think is as important as anything else. The Taiwan Relations Act insists that we maintain the capabilities to maintain peace and stability, to respond to challenges in the Western Pacific. And I do fundamentally agree with my colleagues that we need to do more about our own capabilities. And I'll just, from my own experience over the past 30 years working on these issues, I'll just tell you where I think the big issues are focused. First of all, I do not believe we can take this challenge on by ourselves. We need much deeper engagement with our allies and partners, and that means Japan, that means South Korea, that means Australia, that also means increasingly countries like India and Vietnam, and I will also tell you countries in Europe who also believe that the maintenance of peace and stability is in our interests. We need much greater integration militarily and strategically. We need to embrace these partnerships that go way beyond what we've done in the past, and I think that's critically important. Shipbuilding, something that you all have focused on that we've struggled with. Critical munitions. I was struck very early in the Ukraine crisis at how difficult it was for us to produce what we needed domestically. We're going to need to do this more with allies and partners. And so while I think it is critical that you focus on what Taiwan needs to do and how we need to support Taiwan, remember that we are the ultimate backstop, and we must keep our capabilities, shifting more of our capacity to the Indo-Pacific, recognizing that this is where the ultimate challenge to American power is in the 21st century. Last thing, I'm going to say this carefully if I can. I agree that we are facing enormous challenges from Beijing, but we must be honest that some of the biggest challenges that we're facing are debates here in the United States. We occasionally hear discussion about spheres of interests and influence, and maybe this is too far for us and it's in another major authoritarian country's neighborhood and we should look at this differently. Those concepts are contrary to our strategic interests. They are un-American, and they do not align with our historic responsibilities, our commitments, and what we all believe in. And so I'm asking, not only are you inviting us in today to discuss with you, I'm asking for this committee's leadership to make clear that our interests stand clearly with continuing our vibrant support of the Taiwanese people and what they've achieved technologically, politically, and strategically over the course of the last 40 years with our strong support. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell, and all three witnesses. Now we'll move to questions, and I'd like to begin with General Flynn. In your testimony, you mentioned that America's window for strategic decision-making is closing, and that we must accelerate our own preparations. Can you help us better understand the stakes in the starkest terms possible, given your decades of service, and are we currently moving with enough urgency to, as you put it, accelerate our preparations?
Chairman, no, we're not. I guess I'll just describe, from 2014 to 2024, when I left command, what the Chinese military were doing 10 years ago compared to what they're doing today is dramatically different. And that trajectory that they're on is what we actually have to slow down. The problem is that our organic industrial base is a precursor to our defense industrial base, and they're anemic. And so when Mr. Campbell mentioned about precision munitions and shipbuilding, I'm for all of that. In fact, we need that. In fact, the region needs it because they don't have big air forces and big navies. The U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force must keep the global commons open. But part of the problem is that the thing I lacked as U.S. Army Pacific Commander, and I would say that the combatant commander did as well, was sort of persistent logistics hubs forward, where you could have stores, co-production, you could have distributed and agile locations to be able to draw on those stores. And of course, this requires a really important dance between the Department of State and the Department of Defense to have those locations open and available, although we have things available today. And so I just think the window, Chairman, is narrowing, but it's also narrowing for China as well. So it's not all bad news. President Xi is 71. He'll be 81 in 10 years. And I know that this window of 27 is still, sort of on the table. Are they rehearsing? Are they preparing? Absolutely. But I also think that we're in a very good position to be able to counter them because we have this advantage, and that advantage is the partnerships of the allies and partners in the region. So when we can bring them together as a counterweight to the thing that they try to fragment and fracture every day is our network of allies and partners. So in summary, what I would say is our organic industrial base and defense industrial base, we need your help to get those things moving much faster. But that's not going to get us out of the problem because China is still moving with great speed. Therefore, we have to put capabilities forward, gain positional advantage forward in the region, and we have to do that with our allies and partners, the thing that we enjoy most. And I'll make the point. On the ground where people live, out in these countries, out in these districts, out in these various interior lands in the country, that's where Army forces, along with special operations, along with Marines, along with the sizable armies that are in this region. I mean, one statistic that I want to put on the table right now, the Philippines is 7,500 islands. It's an archipelagic nation. 70% of its military is its army. They have more divisions than the U.S. Army does. They turn to their armies, they turn to their land powers to be able to protect their territorial integrity and protect their national sovereignty. And what I'm saying is if we match up with them we're going to be in a much different place in terms of assurance and deterrence, because those things are going to have to happen on the ground. And back to the organic and industrial base, the more we bring systems forward, the more that they become closer by way of interoperability. I just read yesterday that the Taiwanese did their first live fire with HIMARS. They just bought 29 HIMARS. And you all know where we're going with HIMARS. I had that comment in my opening. That is an incredibly important system. The Japanese, the Philippines are each buying long-range anti-ship missiles. So the point being that that's the connection between technology, the organic and defense industrial base, and the work that we actually have to do on the ground to have hard power forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And just quickly, Admiral Montgomery, you talked a little bit about cyber and resilience for our cyber security. What 2 or 3 things could we be doing to help with that?
So the most important thing for us is to get our rail, aviation, and port systems secure. And the way we do that is through legislation. And that legislation will need to address, and appropriations, it'll need to address the sector risk management agencies. That's U.S. Coast Guard, Transportation Security Agency, and FAA. These are not normally what you think about in a war with China, but they're going to be the front line in the war with China. They have to be properly resourced in order to build the partnerships with the critical infrastructures. And the other problem we have is these ports, rail systems, and aviation. We're not talking about, these are county executive, county and state-run authorities. They don't have 2 wood nickels to rub together. They're going to need access to grant programs to fix the problems, as long as they do an assessment according to a government standard, find that flaw and fix it. But the government's going to have to get involved in this, because the military needs these systems to function so that we can get, as I said, from the forts to the ports and overseas.
Thank you. Now I recognize Ranking Member Krishnamurthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think people in my district and across the country are a little bit on edge economically today. They're worried about access to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. They're also worried about rising costs and a potential recession. But Secretary Campbell, I feel that U.S. economic ties with Taiwan are one of the few bright spots in an otherwise economically uncertain world. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Very much so. And I would just underscore, as you yourself mentioned, what Taiwan provides to us technologically is unique globally. They are the most important ingredient in the global economy with respect to TSMC. But unlike other countries that would hoard those capabilities, as you well understand, they are building fabs now as we speak in the United States to help with that supply. They are really an outstanding partner. I think they believe fundamentally in the partnership with the United States. I completely agree that their role in the global economy should not be underestimated.
Let me show this graph. It shows the remarkable increase in Taiwan's investment in America in recent years, which, as I mentioned before, spiked to $14 billion last year. But this is just the beginning. Apparently, the numbers are going to skyrocket, mostly helping my colleague Greg Stanton in Arizona. But basically, they just announced $100 billion in further investments, TSMC did, in the U.S., which will allow us to produce 30% of the world's most advanced semiconductors shortly. Let me turn to my next topic. This is a sound of an air raid siren. It goes off 3 times a day in Taiwan when Chinese warplanes fly dangerously close to the island. Imagine Russian planes approaching American airspace. Last year, Russia flew warplanes into Alaska's air defense zone 36 times. In contrast, last year, Chinese warplanes flew into Taiwan's air defense zone more than 3,000 times. This is what it looks like. These red lines around the island are basically the path of Chinese warplanes as they traversed the air defense zone surrounding Taiwan. Admiral Montgomery, by doing this, the CCP is trying to wear down Taiwan's defenders and probe Taiwan for weaknesses, right?
Exactly. This is what we would call a maximum pressure campaign. They use these military tools, cyber tools, and other financial and energy tools to put a constant pressure on Taiwan's societal resilience. And then at some later date, they can just dial that up when they see that there's no Western response.
Let me turn to my last topic. While these air crossings happen almost daily, making invasion seem possible, a more likely scenario is a CCP-led blockade of the island. And here's how it could unfold. Step 1, the PLA calls snap exercises, like those after Speaker Pelosi's 2022 visit. You see all these ships surrounding the island. Step 2, instead of leaving, PLA warships stay in place, and then Chinese Coast Guard and militia vessels fill the gaps, creating a de facto blockade, which of course is an act of war. Step 3, the real test comes when imports like corn and soy from Illinois, Michigan, and of course South Dakota try to reach Taiwan, as you see here, but they are stopped by the CCP. In that moment, we are on the brink of war. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were famously, quote unquote, eyeball to eyeball with the Soviets, and the Soviets blinked first. But we don't want to get to that point where we need to be eyeball to eyeball with the CCP. So General Flynn, you'd agree with me that one way Taiwan can deter a blockade is by stockpiling, for instance, corn, soy, natural gas, and so forth, right?
Yes, Ranking Member, absolutely.
What more, Secretary Campbell, do we need to do to show Xi Jinping that he should never think about trying to blockade Taiwan because it would fail?
Thanks. It's a multi-pronged strategy, frankly, Congressman. I completely agree with my colleagues about the things that we need to step up both Taiwan and our capabilities. I will say that deterrence comes with a recognition that if such steps were taken, that China would face the most brutal financial steps taken against it, not just by the United States, but by other countries as well. We also need more stepped-up military capabilities. I think the scenario that you paint, Congressman, is the most likely. Our answer to that, frankly, is our submarine force more than anything else. It is our jewel in the crown. What you all have done recommending that more steps be taken here. I'm a huge supporter of AUKUS. I believe if the United States, Australia, and Great Britain can step up our joint capabilities, that is a major deterrent. We need to keep that area of advantage where we are still 10, 15, 20 years ahead of Beijing in operating in the undersea domain. As long as we have that, it would be very difficult to effect a successful blockade against Taiwan with those capabilities. That's the area that we need to double down on.
Sir, if I could add one cost-free idea, we need to begin practicing escorts and reflaggings with Taiwan. The other, you didn't mention it, but LNG, liquid natural gas, is the real, I think that's the first thing that's going to tighten them up during this. And we need to, ahead of the event, do reflagging and convoy escorts with the Taiwan Navy, practicing with LNGs, and even try to pull the Japanese into that as well, who are equally vulnerable to this. To me, that's a good cost-free way of signaling to China, we're not going to let this happen.
I would add that the picture you paint also is why it's so important for training on the ground in Taiwan for them to be able to see that picture and then be able to paint what they can do by way of countermeasures. This is not just a U.S. problem. This has to be a Taiwan problem, a Japanese problem, a Philippine problem. It's got to be the entire First Island chain to include South Korea. And there are angles and things that we can do from areas to counter what you were just outlining there with the air and the maritime pressure from Taiwan. And that's why that training on island and the technology integration with those forces is so important. And again, I'll just remind people that at the end, the objective is to invade it, and that's the most dangerous scenario. So you can't get that force across 100 miles without us seeing it. And my point would be that we have to have the indications and warnings of what's actually happening in China with the invasion force. So we watch a lot of the air and we watch a lot of the sea, and I agree with this. The submarine force of the United States there's nothing close to it. However, to be able to extend our indications and warnings, we have to collect on the very thing that they need to actually invade, and that's the forces that are in the Eastern Theater Command. And I'm just saying, if we want to increase our indications and warnings and buy time for diplomacy and political intervention, then we need to be watching the thing that they need to actually invade, because they're not going to invade with the Air Force and they're not going to invade with the Navy. You need a gun on the ground to be able to subjugate those people, and that's the most difficult thing that they can do. And my point is, we need to be watching that and putting the technology against watching that. So we buy more time for the United States and others to say, please, what are we doing here? We don't want another war.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Flynn, you do make a powerful case for land power and collecting intel on the invasion force in advance as part of enhancing deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. I'm particularly interested in your testimony and the operations to place systems like Typhoon and HIMARS to deter PLA planning, deployment in the Philippines, shifting the Chinese calculus. I've read about the bellicose response from Beijing related to deployment of these systems in the theater. So we've got them rattled on that. That's a piece of deterrence. I am curious to know your thoughts on cooperation from our partners in the Philippines and Japan on pre-positioning those assets at the EDCA sites in Japan, in the Philippines. And then given, I know we were just in Tokyo, the bipartisan group, their cooperation is spectacular, but with the potential relocation of the Marines from Okinawa to Guam, what is the cooperation we need on these systems in the south of Japan and in the Philippines?
Thanks, sir. Let me start in the Philippines. First of all, the benefit of having 9 EDCA sites is exponential. And I'll use another example. In Aguila Harbor in Subic Bay, we lease 3 million square feet of warehouses. And so we were trying to establish a joint theater logistics center there to be able to have commodities that we could use often. That's one location. And it's not an EDCA site, but it certainly benefits the United States, benefits the Philippine government, and benefits really the network of allies and partners to be able to have those capabilities there on the ground. On the ground, you can do co-production, you can do maintenance forward, you can fix forward, you can arm forward, and then you can distribute to the 9 EDCA sites in the Philippines. So you can see how valuable that port, and it's a deep water port, and the warehouses are. You know, you mentioned Tokyo. I'm going to go to Japan for a minute. Last year I was down in outside of the metropolitan Hiroshima area. There's 2 Army ports down there and 5 different small installations that were built by the Japanese after the Second World War under the U.S. Leadership. We're only using about 40% of the storage on the ground in those facilities. Never mind Sagami Depot outside of Tokyo. Never mind the stores that we have in Kadena and Okinawa. And, of course, the preposition equipment that we have in Korea. I guess the point I'm making is that we have physical access right now. What we don't have, and what I mentioned in my testimony, is that we're not putting the equipment on the ground fast enough. One example, there are 7 vessels that were loaded with prepositioned equipment afloat in the Pacific. We were taking those vessels and just having the equipment float out there. My point was, let's get it on the ground and keep it distributed and give the ships back to the Navy to recap them.
Well, so General, thanks for your service, and I represent the Bluegrass Army Depot, part of the Army Material Command. We need to do exactly what you suggest and pre-position over in the theater. Let me ask a quick question to Deputy Secretary Campbell. Strategic ambiguity. This has been a diplomatic debate. Should we abandon strategic ambiguity? Would deterrence be served by shifting to clarity as a policy of deterrence?
My own view would be that the policy that we've adopted over the last 40 years, which I believe has substantial elements of clarity within it, but our declaratory position that you described, I believe, has served our strategic interests. And I believe there's still elements of that can and should be sustained going forward. So I'm more focused on the steps that we're talking about here in terms of preparation. But I also believe we've been unmistakable strategically in our public declarations about what we stand for and what we...
Let me drill down on a detail of that. As you know, the PRC uses UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 to isolate Taiwan by misinterpreting the resolution to justify its fraudulent one China principle. Although the resolution makes no mention of Taiwan, does not authorize the PRC to represent Taiwan in the UN system, and certainly does not state that Taiwan is part of the PRC. What should be the U.S. position on China using 2758 to claim that Taiwan is part of China?
We should resist that at every possible effort, both in New York, in Geneva, and all the other UN activities that we're undertaking. Look, the truth is that the UN is a pretty important battleground for hearts and minds in the global South. We're frankly hurting our ability to operate in many of those capacities. I think one of the reasons to engage here is that it is essential that we get all these other countries in Latin America, Africa, and elsewhere that are buying into this approach to understand that it's contrary to their interests as well.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Moulton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the distinguished witnesses for your years of service to our country. And I tell you, we've had, I've certainly had a lot of interactions, especially with General Flynn and Mr. Campbell, and you've always been incredibly bipartisan and thoughtful and really focused on the national security concerns at stake here. So thank you for that. The ranking member is right that many Americans don't know where Taiwan is. But what's most dangerous is how many don't understand why Taiwan is so important. Don't understand how many chips they carry with them every day that can only be produced on this tiny island. Now, sitting on the Armed Services Committee and the China Committee, I can tell you I am confident that if Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party do what they have promised to do and try to take over this island, try to start this war, we will win it. We will defeat them. But hundreds of thousands will die. We could lose the satellites that enable GPS, so no more Google Maps to get home. And it would be a horrific worldwide economic calamity. So the point is that we have to succeed at deterrence. Now, General Flynn, you said that deterrence is the sum of posture, capability, messaging, and will. I would posit that you can win without posture. Armies have won throughout history without the best capability, and we don't often have the right messaging. But my concern is will. I don't think it's helpful to have a president equivocate on whether we would defend Taiwan as President Trump has. Given where we are today, how do we ensure that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party understand America and Taiwan's will to fight?
Sir, I think this is why we have to have positional advantage forward. There's no substitute for hard power being forward. And as cited earlier, the Typhoon system and others that are in the Philippines, they get the attention of President Xi.
That's a good answer.
And I think what we're trying to do is sow doubt and feed paranoia there because they did not calculate for those systems being brought in there.
Admiral Montgomery, what do you think? Sorry,
I agree with your assumption that your presumption that we need to deter them. What I would say is that I do think that it's the real deterrence is us and Taiwan becoming more integrated. I don't share General Flynn's optimism about Japan, Philippines, Australia actually contributing. They may give us access during combat. I'm not sure they can contribute. The one country I know will contribute to the defense of Taiwan is Taiwan. And currently, our military coordination is that our military interoperability is down at the deconflicted level, the lowest level. We have to raise it to coordinated, integrated, and eventually unified. And this normally takes 10 to 15 years.
That's
we
very
need to do
helpful.
this in the next 2 to 3.
Thank you, Secretary Campbell.
Frankly, I'm much more optimistic about the role of our allies. I've seen over years countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea, even...
Okay, but how do we reinforce this will?
Are you talking about the will domestically?
Yes.
Frankly, hearings like this, we need much more discussion. Frankly, just having people understand that our economy grounds to a halt without our access to the key technologies of Taiwan. This is an educational effort. I will also say, I think the real strength of what we've seen in our engagement in the Indo-Pacific, it has been largely bipartisan. It needs to stay that way, and major policy things need to be debated and discussed and not sort of decided from on high without appropriate consultation.
Thank you. Just a quick diversion to Rhea Montgomery, your comment on Golden Dome, because I think it's really important that we're investing in the right things here. How long will it take us to design, build, and deploy this capability?
Look, if we do it right, we're going for the long term. The worst thing we can do right now is go by...
It's been estimated 15 years. How long do you think it will take our adversaries to...
So I think a space-based system is now 5 to 8 years ago, and they would be both search and tracking.
If one of our adversaries is willing to launch a massive attack against us, which this system is designed to stop, thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles, don't you think they'd be willing to detonate just a single missile to take out every LEO satellite, to take out that defense system?
So this is not about stopping a nuclear exchange. What will stop a nuclear exchange is mutual assured destruction. What we need Golden Dome for is the hypersonic missiles, cruise missiles, and conventionally armed ballistic missiles that China and Russia are now building.
What you just said, I think, is incredibly important, and it's lost on a lot of people in understanding Golden Dome. So thank you for that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Dunn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses as well for the testimony today. And let me just say, Mr. Chairman, you've put together an incredibly distinguished panel this morning. It's a real pleasure to drag myself out of bed just for a chance to talk to these gentlemen. It's incumbent upon us in Congress to decisively put a stop to the PRC's plans to forcefully annex Taiwan. Taiwan is our strategic partner, shares similar commitment to democratic values, and we cannot allow the PLA, PRC to continue to run amok, bullying and jeopardizing the security of our allies throughout the world. To accomplish this, we have to optimize and revitalize America's defense industrial base and the defense workforce to maintain competitive military readiness, and America has to close the gap in defense production capacity. Otherwise, our enemies, China, Iran, and Russia, will continue to threaten our allies throughout the world. As policymakers, we must continue efforts to establish comprehensive security strategy that prioritizes a ready military posture. And I'm a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I'll present a report on the need for defense industrial base shifts in America, Canada, and in Europe at the upcoming NATO PA Summit next week in Dayton, Ohio. The U.S. has to lead these global efforts, I think, including in cyber deterrence, strengthening partnerships, and I mean beyond the Five Eyes intelligence alliance to build collective defensive alliances. We've heard through our previous work in this committee that the PRC will stop at nothing to control, dominate, and exacerbate any and every vulnerability to carve out a strategic advantage for itself, and it remains critical that we establish comprehensive security strategy to respond to that, and I look forward to continuing this work with my colleagues and with our allies. And let me say, I think this panel exemplifies the American commitment to that goal. General Flynn, good to see you again, sir. First, could you talk about the critical infrastructure challenges in the Indo-Pacific and how they impact the military's ability to operate throughout the region?
Admiral Montgomery mentioned, I'll just refer to them as power projection platforms. They're vulnerable. They're vulnerable to cyber attacks and infections, essentially, that are on those networks. I would also say that, as I mentioned in my remarks, because it's tied to the comment you're making, our ability to have the raw materials of steel, aluminum, magnets, batteries, even the microchips, as he held the phone up, Representative Moulton, right? Those come from the rare earth elements that we need. So we're not going to be able to get this organic industrial base back on its feet until we can gain access into those markets and make sure that we have those here. So the combination of our ability to project power is vulnerable from cyber, and then our ability to actually move the power is tied to our organic.
Thank you for calling attention to the basics. I mean, it really is blocking and tackling. Sometimes it's not just high tech. I do want to say also, Admiral Paparo, I'm sure you know, Commander U.S. Indo-PACOM, gave China's armed forces last month high marks for their ability to prevent the U.S. forces from achieving air superiority in the first island chain. Do you think that's true?
Yes, I do.
Ouch.
Hey, can I add to
yes,
that? I think that's true for the first 2 weeks. Our goal, and maybe only 1 week, our plan is to roll back Chinese aircraft. If we can't roll it back in under 7 to 10 days, in my mind, the ground forces that Charlie's been talking about, the Taiwan ground forces, will get overrun by a Chinese lodgment. So I think we really have to get it back pretty rapidly.
We have to get it back, but the challenge that we're talking about is getting it back is at what cost?
We have work to do. I do want to get to the Honorable Kirk Campbell, the one man who may have spent more time in Indo-Pacific than everybody else in the room put together. It's good to see you again, sir. Could you speak about how investing in our allies, partners, and particularly through infrastructure projects impacts America's competition with China, specifically in Indo-Pacific?
Great, thank you, and I very much appreciate the comments that you've made, Congressman. I do want to just underscore one other point that was just made about investment into the United States. If you look over the last 5 years,
今天影片到这就结束，喜欢记得订阅我，不喜欢记得一定要封锁。下半集我会尽量找时间赶快把它翻译出来给大家看。